We're going to be discussing together Let the Nations Be Glad, the Supremacy of God in Missions. Pastor John wrote this book originally in 1993. It was published 31 years ago. It's gone through several editions, the most recent being the 30th anniversary edition from just last year. So we look forward to sharing that with you. All of these students have read the book and come prepared with questions. And so we'd like to invite you in to a conversation and also to give you a taste of why this book continues to shape conversations about missions even today, 31 years later. So welcome. And for our first question, Sang Yung is going to introduce us by asking a question, Pastor John, about his interest in missions.
Test? Okay. Pastor John, in this book and throughout the rest of your ministry, you put forward the supremacy of God and His glory and its relationship to our experience as human beings, namely that God is most glorified when we are most satisfied in Him. You have written that Jonathan Edwards was instrumental in helping you to see these realities and how this was a life-changing moment for you. My question is, did your passion for missions grow in connection with that story of discovering Christian hedonism? When did missions first become important to you, and what has that looked like in your life since then?
The connection between Christian hedonism, which emerged in about 1968 in my consciousness, did not have, to my shame, a dominant, pervasive, or I would say even significant impact on my world Christianity until 1983. So what is that, 15 years? So you get 15 years of percolating while I'm reading my Bible badly. I mean, this is a lesson, folks, of how Bible-oriented people like me, who all I do is read the Bible, it's my job, can miss things. And when somebody eventually points you to them and hits you with a 2x4, you say, how did I miss that? What? So, the kindling was laid early. My dad loved missions. He prayed about the glory of God and missions every night when he was home. And Wheaton went there for college, had a missions focus. I remember it. It was inspiring. Fuller, I took courses from Ralph Winter, who was the craziest gung-ho mission statesman ever was in the 20th century. And then it didn't do much. It didn't affect much. So I come here to be a pastor in 1980. And we had a missions conference that I inherited. And it involved 2 weekends and the days in between. And they didn't have the pastor preach either of those Sundays. So I didn't have to preach on missions. Nobody asked me to until 1983. And I'm preaching a series on Christian hedonism. And they said, Pastor, why don't you do the first week of Missions Week? That was epic making. I mean, seriously, it was epic making. I mean, the book is an epic. And so the sermon was titled, The Battle Cry of Christian Hedonism, Missions. And I just had to say, what does a Christian hedonist say about the nations? Which I should have said over and over and over for 15 years and didn't. And I'll just give you several texts that just went bang. The text, I think, for that sermon was Mark 10, the rich young ruler. And the rich young ruler walked away, and Jesus said, it is hard for the rich to get into the kingdom. And the disciples throw up their hands, well, then who can be saved? which showed how they were thinking. And Jesus said, with man it is impossible, but with God nothing is impossible. In other words, missions. I can remember in 1967, Noelle and I, my fiance, went to Urbana in 1967. And what was his name? I always get Warren Webster and John Alexander mixed up. They were a big deal back in the 60s. Whichever one said, when I went to the mission field, I said, if I believed in predestination, why would I ever be a missionary? God's already decided who's going to get saved. Why would you go to the mission field? And he said, after 20 years in Pakistan, now I say, if I didn't believe in predestination, why would I go to the mission field? I remember hearing that. I'm now a 7-point Calvinist. And that didn't do it. It shows how slow we are to make connections between what we hold dear and things we don't think much about. So anyway, that part of the text came, okay, you believe in the sovereignty of God, the glory of a sovereign God. Well, here's a God that says, I can save anybody, rich man, poor man, Pakistani, American, anybody. I can save anybody. So get about it globally. The other part of the text was Peter saying, hey, we've left everything and followed you. And really, I think it was something like that. I mean, I think that was the idea. Like, okay, we're not like the rich guy. We've left everything and followed you. Like, we've made the appropriate sacrifice. Jesus didn't like that. Remember what he said? He said, nobody has left mother or father or son or daughter or houses or lands for my sake, who will not receive back 100-fold in this life with persecutions and in the age to come eternal life. So get off your self-pity kick, Peter. Nobody can out-sacrifice me. You're in it for joy, and I mean you to be. I mean, that was my paraphrase. And I thought, okay, so you got the sovereignty of God. He can conquer anybody's heart. And you've got him telling Peter, this is not about self-pity. It's not about sacrifice, ultimately. It's about finding where your true treasure is and going for broke. That was the text. Then one more, and I'll stop because I'm not supposed to take the whole time on one. We got nine people up here. One more. And this seals the deal, right, because of the title of the book. So what is Psalm 96? Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord and bless his name. Tell of his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations. Piper, look, what are you doing? Declare his glory among the nations. So there you got glory. Then you go to Psalm 67. Make your face to shine upon us. Let the nations praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. And they go tell them I'm glorious. Go tell them to be glad. Oh. It was over. I mean, the battle was over. And the next decade of my life, that was 83, did I say, that sermon? And this came out in 93, is that what you said? So there you go. 10 years, all I did, I mean, that's an overstatement. A lot of what I did was conference after effort to make up for lost time in world missions. Yeah, a Christian hedonist is a person who believes that God is most glorified in us when we're most satisfied in him. And there you have a psalm saying, go make the world satisfied. Go tell the world I'm glorious. And that's Christian hedonism.
Excellent. Thank you for getting us started. The beginning of the book does talk about the purpose and the power and the price of missions. So Selah's going to begin a few questions for us on those topics.
Yeah. In reading your book, I wondered if there is a danger in treating people simply as a means to the end of God's glory. While we see in your book it's important that we are zealous for all people to worship God and also to show compassion, How do we keep that big picture of God's glory in mind while not thinking of people as projects to complete for the sake of God's glory?
Yeah.
Or is there even a problem with that type of thinking?
Let me add one piece to your question. So here's the nub that I'm hearing. You're going to head into the world and you're going to say your dominant motive is, I want God to be glorious in this world. I want every human being to know he's God, the kind of God we heard from Andy this morning. That's God. And he's glorious. And I'm in the world to get you to do that. And they might feel, so what about me? You care about me at all? Do I matter to you? So that's the question you asked. Let me duplicate it with the other half of Christian hedonism, because this has been said to me. So you're saying, Piper, that you're motivated not just by the glory of God, but you want to be happy. You want your joy to increase. So you're in this business of Christianity to be happier. That's exactly right, I am. Christian hedonism is a life devoted to pleasure. So, you're just selfish. You just out and out selfish. You do not care about me, you care about you. You're going to make me a project for your joy. So we've got two problems, not just one. Are you a project to get glory for God? Are you a project to make me happy? And these questions do not intimidate me. I am so excited to answer these kinds of questions. I mean, I love that question because Christian hedonism is the answer to both of those questions. So let's take mine first, then yours. I mean, seriously, you have to have an answer. If you even come close to being a biblical Christian, which I think is a Christian hedonist, you have to have an answer to this question. Namely, so you're talking to somebody about Jesus and you want to lead them to Jesus. And they kind of pick up on your hedonism and they say, so you really are talking to me right now to increase your happiness. I said, that's exactly what I'm doing. Well, how's that not selfish? I would say, it's not selfish because nobody accuses a person of selfishness if they're willing to lay down their lives to draw another person into the sharing of their joy. Did that go by too fast? Nobody is accused of selfishness if they say, I will lay down my life to include you into the joy that I'm pursuing. And not only will I lay down my life to include you in it, it will make mine bigger if you come. Your joy will be my joy. That's a Bible statement in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. I think you can persuade unbelievers that makes sense, even if they don't like it. I'm not selfish. I mean, I used to go to the hospital to visit people, right, when I was here. And so here's Mabel. We'll call her Mabel because she's 85 years old. And she just had a heart attack, and her son calls me, would you visit my mom? And I walk in to Mabel's room, and she's all hooked up with tubes. I don't know if she's going to make it. And her eyes are closed, and her skin is all shriveled, and there's bruises all over her. And I didn't feel like coming. So I walk up, I put my arm on her, she opens her eyes, and she says, oh, Pastor, you shouldn't have. Now, old people always say, you shouldn't have. Young people say, it's about time. But she's old, and so she says, you shouldn't have. And I could say, I know, and I didn't want to, but I'm a pastor. I'm a pastor, and I have to. It's my duty. But I don't say that. I say, Mabel, I'm here because it makes me so happy to share the best news in the world with you right now. Not in 1,000 years would she say, "You're so selfish, make you happy." She wouldn't say that. It's not true. So that's the answer to my question that you didn't ask. It's exactly the same answer for the glory of God. If they say, you don't care about me, you just care about your God. You just want him to look glorious. You don't give a rip about my happiness. And of course, my response to that is, can I tell you about what the beauty of Christianity is? The beauty of Christianity is that we have the kind of God who gets most glory in making you most happy in him. This is not about choosing between your happiness and God's glory. It just doesn't work that way in Christianity. Might work that way in other religions, I don't know. In Christianity, you dare not choose between your happiness and God's glory. Now look them right now. You got that? You may not choose. You may not choose between your happiness and God's glory. As soon as you try to choose to nullify your happiness, God will not get the glory he deserves. You must pursue your happiness. Right now, you must pursue your maximum happiness. That's why I'm here. Because I'm elevating the glory of God, because that's the only thing that will make you truly happy. You were made for something way, way bigger than all the stuff you're living for right now. So I just wouldn't buy it that I have turned them into a project, because the key to God's getting glory is they're getting happy in him. And a person whose happiness is being pursued like that doesn't feel like a project.
So Pastor John, staying with the heart issue there, but going in a slightly different direction, you allude to Matthew 16:24 when you say, and I'll quote you, "To take up a cross and follow Jesus means to join Jesus on the Calvary road with a resolve to suffer and die with him." Shortly afterward, you then balance this with a reminder, again quoting, "Christian martyrs do not pursue death, they pursue love." So as you intentionally aim to stoke the fires of zeal for missions, how would you counsel us, how would you counsel churches so as to avoid developing a martyrdom complex where you have this burning zeal to die for Jesus, but you're comparatively cold towards the more mundane, more daily, actual ministry of serving to people?
If I knew any church like that, I would be happy to work on that problem. Any of your churches in danger of creating martyr complexes? I mean, I'm going to make your question valid anyway. Because it is. I mean, seriously, I wish that were a problem. Okay. The value in your question is that it is possible to head toward the mission field with idealized, romanticized notions even of suffering. It's not going to go well if you do. It's interesting you referred to the Calvary Road. So the Calvary Road ended at Calvary, but it was a road, and all of it was hard. So if you think, my life's going to end gloriously, somebody write an article about me, maybe a biography, that discounts the mundane, the road, reading for class what you're supposed to read, getting your clothes washed, paying your bills. So I think what I would do to counsel those churches is say, you need, one, a robust doctrine of suffering. And by robust, I mean enough to handle martyrdom, but also enough to handle setting your alarm early enough to have devotions. That's a self-denial. And isn't it interesting that in Luke's version of deny yourself, he said daily. Take up your cross daily. So there's martyrdom, and then there's daily crosses. And most of them are very inglorious. They're just plain boring, hard, ordinary. Nobody's praising you for them. They don't even know you were faithful in that obligation. So, a robust doctrine of self-denial and suffering for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of your ultimate happiness that is big enough to handle death and big enough to handle 1,000 deaths that are not glorious at all. I think that's probably the way I'd counsel the church. Does that get at it?
I think so, yeah. So there's a saying of everyone wants to save the world, but no one's going to help mom with the dishes.
That's good.
And it sounds like you're saying that underlying is this misguided zeal, and even having a more robust theology of suffering will help you in those mundane sufferings where you're not constantly striving for the big suffering.
Yeah. Yes, that's a great quote. And I take your question as a warning to me, because I do, and I will tonight even, move toward the ultimate quickly, because I think it's a good test case to see how people respond to the ultimate suffering. But probably the other piece of the counsel, in view of what you just said, that I would give to a church is don't send missionaries that you haven't put to work here in a lot of ordinary ways and seen how they responded. Are they just wanting the big glory, over there? Or are they willing to walk down 11th Avenue and pick up the trash? Are they willing to walk up to a guy with his lighter under his tinfoil, sniffing his smoke, and tell him about Jesus? And if they're not, don't send them. So, yeah.
In chapter 3, you quote Jonathan Edwards' beautiful little sermon, Heaven is a World of Love, to explain how the differing degrees of reward in heaven will not be the cause of envy or pride in the glorified saints. However, while on earth, how are those who are not as successful in their missionary efforts, despite months, years, even decades of faithful labor, to keep from becoming envious? And so, kind of rephrasing, how would you counsel missionaries to think about fruitfulness, even if they're not seeing obvious fruit in their labor?
That's really important. Let me say a word about envy first, and then the other part. It's not wrong to want to be fruitful. It's not wrong to want to be as fruitful as somebody else is fruitful. Envy is being resentful that they're more fruitful than you are. It galls you. That's envy. The desire for more hope, more love, more patience, more kindness, more faith, like them. A hero. That's not sinful. The Bible holds up examples all the time that we're supposed to imitate, long to be like them. Envy is when we start this niggling sense of, I'd like to see them stumble. That's dangerous. That is so dangerous. You see somebody and they're making it, they don't stumble, and they're walking, and you sense I'd like to see them take a fall. That is so far from the Spirit of Christ. So that's envy, and it is owing to pride and ego. I need my ego to be stroked by superiority, not fruitfulness, but superiority to your fruitfulness. That's wicked. Okay. Now, what do you say to help people press on in all the varying degrees of fruitfulness in the world? I mean, you just look around this room. Nobody's identical to anybody. It's amazing how diverse you are. And some of you are so good at some things and not good at other things. And if you spend your life comparing, you will die. Mark Knoll, the historian, my class at Wheaton, we graduated together, had a little piece of paper he tacked on he was my RA my senior year, even though we were in the same class. And outside his door, he tacked up a little saying, "To love is to stop comparing." Mark was a 4.0 student. He was operating from the be admired side. And he knew as long as people stood in such awe of him, he wouldn't have very good relationships. So we must be careful in that regard. Now, what about, how do you do it then? If you're not going to compare, and you know their church grew, my church didn't grow. Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the growth, therefore neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. So you bow before the sovereignty of God and you say, he gave growth there, he didn't give growth here. God is God, I'm not God. I love God, he's good, he's just, he's wise. That's one answer. The sovereignty of the goodness of God disposing his gifts and his blessings where he please. Second thing you might take into consideration is Billy Graham. Some of you don't even know who Billy Graham is, to your shame. I say that because I talked to a guy who was as young as some of you, and he'd never heard of Billy Graham. I said, okay. Billy Graham said when he used to have his mission in town here, just write Billy Graham, Minneapolis, 123, box 123. That's all you need. Probably just Billy Graham, he'd get there. He said in a chapel to his 100-person staff, most of whom were ordinary mail handlers and secretaries, and he said, don't you, that in line for rewards in heaven, a lot of you will be ahead of me for rewards. And I remember, what was her name? She said, she was telling me this story, and most of us, she said, we kind of rolled our eyes, like, right, Billy, that's such inappropriate humility. And he got very stern because he could see it. And he said, God rewards faithfulness, not fruitfulness. 1,000 people may walk to the front of my crusades, and you're the means of saving one person in your life. Your rewards may be greater because your mind was purer. Your duties were fulfilled with greater care. You were faithful morning to night in 1,000 ways. And here I am battling, I'm making this up, battling lust, greed, and whatever, and hanging on by my fingernails with the gift to move 50,000 people. That's so important, folks. That is so important. If you keep going in chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians, you've got the man whose life is passed through the fire, and the wood and the hay and the stubble are burned up, and he doesn't get rewards for that. Well, what was that? That was not fruitfulness or failure at fruitfulness. It was bad teaching. I laid the foundation. Other people are building on it with wood, hay, and stubble. It's going to be burned up, and they're going to squeak by. So you don't say, "Oh, my lack of fruitfulness is what's going to get burned up at the last day." That's not what he's talking about. There's one other thing maybe comes to my mind. I've often wondered what success I might have had as a pastor in Brazil or Mississippi, place where they have emotions. Because I can get into that, right? I can preach to people like that. my church might grow. Now, here's the point. Planting a church in New Hampshire and planting a church in Mississippi are radically different challenges, not to mention Afghanistan. And therefore, if you measure yourself in New Hampshire by the guy in Mississippi, that's not a wise thing to do. So taking into account factors, gifts, location, culture, all kinds of things might shape what kind of fruitfulness your life has.
Yeah, thank you. Next, we have a couple questions on missions practice and priorities coming from the middle section of Let the Nations Be Glad. Eddie will get us started.
Okay. This question is about unreached people groups and the strategy that churches employ to reach them. The desire to finish the task. Should we think of missions as a continuous process of reaching unreached people groups as they sprout, rather than a time-specific snapshot of people group data collected by a mission organization? In a migration-heavy and constantly changing world, should missions be about finishing or being faithful to the task?
You and I have talked about this just a little bit before. So when I saw that you were going to ask that question, I thought, that's good. We get to talk about it out loud with everybody. Those are not alternatives in my mind. Work on finishing, work on being faithful are like fruit and apples. Or no, it's apples and fruit. Yeah, I think I missed that. So here's what drives me not to write off the finishing mindset. Finish the Great Commission. Work on it. Be part of it. I mean, back in the 1980s, we were saying, by 2000, come Lord Jesus. And I don't think that was a bad thing to do. I mean, date setting is a bad thing to do, but praying toward it is not a bad thing to do. Come Lord Jesus is the prayer every saint should pray. Sooner the better. No, I lost my thought. Where was I going?
Finish the task. It's still valid.
That's right. Thank you. Dr. Fuller I'm going to lose it again here. Dr. Fuller used to say, I just lost the ball in the tall grass. Somebody help me. What was I talking about? Okay, let me see if I can find it again now.
Finish the task is still valid.
Finish the task is still valid because Jesus said, go and make disciples of all nations. So go and do panta ta ethne, whatever that is. Go for it. Disciple them, baptize them, teach them, and keep doing it until you've got panta, all of them. That's one. And another one, John said, and you were slain, Jesus, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and have made them a kingdom, priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth. So you died to ransom people from all of them. Be about the business of getting those ransomed from all of them. Like Paul in Corinth, I have many people in this city, so don't stop preaching. Don't be afraid. Preach. I'll draw my people to the gospel. And the third is Matthew 24:14, where he said, this gospel will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Like, oh, there's a connection between the end and reaching all the nations. Now, I remember George Ladd, New Testament scholar, previous generation, my teacher at Fuller, wrote New Testament theology, The Presence of the Kingdom, lots of good books. And he did an article on the meaning of Peter's phrase, hasten the day of God. Like, what in the world is that? God has a day fixed. What do you mean, hasten the day of God? And he said, there's one way to hasten the day of God. Finish the mission. I thought that was pretty good. So that's my impulse about don't lose the finishing mindset. I hope you don't. I know from talking to one person here already that there are people in this room on their way to the mission field. And I was praying with my wife 45 minutes ago that there would be more because of this little moment right here. that some of you would come to this and you're wobbly about your future, and by the end of this conference, you wouldn't be wobbly anymore. Now I just lost it again. Where was I going?
Yeah, but then the faithful side, faithful versus finish.
Yes. I don't think that was where I was going, but I'll go there because I can't think where I was going. The faithful side is that we don't know. We don't know. And I think one of the things you think about, Eddie, is the fact that unreached peoples is a amorphous idea. It's not clearly defined even when you say tribe, people, tongue, nation. You take those four, like, can you draw nice lines between those? No. Can you tell how wide they are? No. But there's a lot of them. It's probably not taxi drivers in Mumbai. I don't like it when you use people groups like that, because I don't think Jesus had that kind of thing in mind. I think he had ethno-linguistic groups, a little more manageable than every layer of job, So I'm not happy with that kind of treatment. But your point, or some people's point, is some of those are going out of existence, little teeny tribes, and some are coming into existence. I mean, if you give long enough. So what did Jesus mean? And frankly, I don't know. I don't know how Jesus would answer that question of go to all the nations, and he has in mind, he can see thousands of ethno-linguistic people groups, 7, 8, 10,000, whatever there are. And he knew that some of those tiny tribes at that point in South America or North America wouldn't exist by the time missionaries got there. And so all I can say is he knew that, he didn't intend that, and we shouldn't press it that hard. But faithfulness means wherever God calls you in the process of finishing, and we all fit at different places. I've never been a missionary. It should be a lesson for a lot of you that I wrote a book on missions. It's 30 years old. It's used in classes. It's made a difference, and I've never been a missionary. That's weird. I mean, that's weird. How can that be? Well, that should tell you there's all kinds of ways God's going to use you. Well, you can't even imagine. Okay, so yes to faithfulness, yes to finishing, both and.
So, Pastor John, this question is related a little bit to this previous one. There are lots of churches that send church planting missionaries and evangelists to already reached places, such as countries in South America, Africa, and Asia. You talk about how the center of gravity in world Christianity is shifting towards, South and East, Latin America, etc. So, for instance, in my hometown in Mexico, there were lots of missionaries that came to preach the gospel, though the gospel had already been preached there decades ago. And, typically, missionary would come, plant a church, then they would leave. An untrained or unqualified leader would rise up to the pulpit, eventually culminating in scandal, heresy, and a broken church. So, what should the emphasis of missions look like in countries like these? Or more specifically, should education and training, that is, theological education and pastoral training, replace the more traditional evangelism route as the primary focus to places that have already been reached?
Yeah, my reaction to that last question is no, but I want to say not a quick no, because the word traditional may carry a freight in your vocabulary that I'm not fully aware of. So let me see if I can put myself in your head and answer what you really mean. I have been, since 1985, 2 years after the awakening, when I went to Cameroon for the first time, and saw, I thought Wycliffe was a frontline mission organization. Wycliffe is a church renewal project. Wycliffe Bible Translators. This church has been here for 150 years. What's going on here? Why why such dependence on the West after 150 years? And I've thought a lot about, and just to be fair, you didn't come into being in 150 years. You came into being in 2,000 years. This country is shot through with churches, publishing houses, seminaries, Bible colleges, Christian influence at every level, all over the place, not because of 150 years, but because of a long first 400 years of battling through the truth. And then a long season of seasoning during the Middle Ages, and then a hundreds of years of reformation and restraightening and trying to get things right, and then a couple of awakenings, and then a new start on this land, and here you are, and you know a lot. You are more biblically informed than almost all Christians prior to, say, 300 years ago, 400 years ago. So here we are, and you're talking about a country that's had the gospel for 40 years or 50 years or 100 years. You say, what's wrong? Get your act together. Like, are you kidding me? Who are you to be talking? You bear the fruit of thousands of years of labor and refinement. And so we really need to be patient. Now, your question is, so should we alter the strategies that would keep what you just described from happening? And I think probably yes. And when I think who might be doing that, I'm thinking of Dudene, of course, in Cameroon, because Dudene loves his country, Cameroon. He sees the doctrinal chaos and the weakness of the church, and so he wants there to be evangelism. Now, I would have no problem saying traditional evangelism. He wants that to happen. Go tell people about Jesus. Have a strong church. Send them out as salt. They talk about Jesus. They bring them. They get saved. They disciple them. That's what they should be doing. But he knows, I got to train pastors. If we don't have pastors who don't abdicate from the gospel and don't cheat on their wives. Now, parenthesis, we know from recent news you can be as trained as possible and still make shipwreck of your ministry, right? Okay, close that parenthesis. But what we need all over the world is both and. Every question here is probably a both and question. Namely, we need people with a vision for deep training, strengthening leaders, growing up indigenous pastors who stand on their own two theological feet. Here's a little anecdote to overstate the case, but I loved Ralph Winter. He almost overstated everything. I remember he walked in, and if I say this, I'm going to lose my train of thought. I won't go there. He said, when I asked him, what does it mean to be a reached people group, Dr. Winter? And he smiled and he said, when the local people have Greek and Hebrew and are writing their own books for their own seminaries and colleges. I said, that's a long time. But the truth in the overstatement was, because if you stay with a people group that long, you won't reach all of them. Although, another qualification, some are called to stay there, but not everybody. There are different kind of missionaries, right? There's the Paul-type missionaries and Timothy-type missionaries, and Paul says, I'm going to the unreached people, and Timothy says, I'm staying in Ephesus, and Titus says, I'm staying in Crete, and they're growing up elders and trying to evangelize the lost there. So I think the answer to your question is, if, in your judgment, the traditional approach has been get people saved and don't do much theological preparation for 50 years from now, that should change.
So since we believe that God will work in the hearts of those we interact with among the nations, and we trust his sovereignty in each conversation we have with the unreached? How should we go about pursuing relationships with those who aren't open to the gospel immediately? Should we consider this a closed door, or should we consider or continue to pursue relationships, trusting that the Lord will work through our faithfulness to the Great Commission?
You asked earlier which question I found most interesting, and I said, I know the one I found most difficult, that one. I have seen these questions before. Truth in advertising. Jesus sent out his disciples 2 by 2, and he said, if you enter a town and they do not receive you, knock the dust off your robe and go to another city. Like, whoa. And Paul, in Acts 13, I think Antioch of Pisidia, goes first Sunday, Sabbath, in the synagogue and blows them away with this long sermon. And someone say, come back next Sunday, we want to hear more of this. And he comes back, and the opposition is enormous. And Paul, I can picture him putting up his hand and saying, look, if you judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life, I'm turning to the Gentiles. He leaves the synagogue. He's gone. Leaves them in their lostness, unless they want to come to the meeting. So I've got these texts in my mind that are discouraging me at one level from lingering too long with resistant people. And you love people like that. And you'd lay down your life for them right now. And you don't want people to forsake them. You're praying right now that people would go into their lives and ask them for the 1,000th time if they believe or wouldn't they believe. You don't want to go this route. And I don't think the Bible has that as its only message about how to do evangelism. That's one message. It's true. Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine, which I think means something like, if the resistance is so ugly, so bitter, so skeptical, so cynical, you just say, okay, I'm going to talk to some other people right now, excuse me. So there's a place for, I'm done with you. The reason, a couple of reasons why I don't think that's the only message of the New Testament is one, what I said earlier about two kinds of missionaries, Paul type and Timothy type. So Paul was a frontier missionary, a pioneer missionary. When he had reached northern Greece, Illyricum, from Jerusalem to Illyricum, so Jerusalem up through Syria, across Asia Minor, over into Greece, down to Corinth, up the coast to Illyricum, northern Italy, he said, I have no more room for work in these regions. Are you kidding me? Tens of thousands of unbelievers lived in that region. What did he mean? I have no more room for work. He meant, I'm a frontier missionary. The church exists here. I'm going to Spain. Now, that kind of person will not spend too long with a recalcitrant people. I'm gone. But you know what he did in Ephesus and Crete? He left Timothy and Titus. And he wrote letters to them to tell them how to do their work. And they said, do the work of an evangelist. Well, what does that mean? It meant you got a region, you're responsible for it, and you're supposed to stay right there. Just send your people out to be as loving and as creative as they can. They'll figure out how often they can talk to a person, just like you're trying to figure out how many emails to write to your loved one. That was one. Here's the other one. The other biblical impulse that makes me think the knock the dust off and get moving is not the only message. Do you remember that parable? I guess it's a parable where Jesus says a man owned a fig tree, and he said, that fig tree has not borne any fruit for 3 years, cut it down. It shouldn't even waste the ground. And this unknown spokesman, whoever it is in the parable, says, sir, could we just wait 1 more year and put some fertilizer around it? And then if it doesn't bear fruit, you can cut it down. Now, what's the point of that parable? I think it's a double point. I think the first point is, you are close to being cut down, Israel. Don't toy with me. I've come offering you the gospel. You need to repent and bear the fruits worthy of repentance, Israel, or you're coming down. The axe is laid to the root of the tree. And the other point of the parable is there's this impulse of, give it another year. It's just, give them another visit. Give them another visit. And I don't know where to draw the line. And you don't know. Your heart will make it plain, won't it? I mean, that's what we do every day. We just plead with the Holy Spirit. Make me to know when to talk and when not to talk, what to say and what not to say. The Bible simply doesn't give us all the specifics about how frequently to talk to an unbeliever or what to say. It's both and.
We have time for 2 more questions. Julie's going to ask one first about chapter 7 that talks about the difference between inward and outward worship as a New Testament concept.
So I've spent 2 years at the Gettysburg Conference, and I've always come away greatly enriched by just their vision of the church, corporate worship, global missions, and most definitely eternity. And at the conference this year, you pressed into the doctrine of God as the foundation for our delight in Him, which should flow forth in praise. In chapter 7 of Let the Nations Be Glad, you place a similar emphasis on passion for God and His glory in Christ as the foundation for inward affection that leads to outward worship. But you also make clear that in the New Testament, Jesus presents a new model for worship that does not necessarily imply corporate gathering. Rather, Jesus emphasizes a posture of heart over form and outward expression. In light of these things, is it problematic that we refer to worship as corporate worship if worship is in fact a primarily inward action?
It can be problematic. If I'm in a conversation, I will listen to discern when people use the word worship, if they mean a set of forms or if they mean something in the heart. So yes, it can be a problem. Little anecdote about the book. In the first edition, I mean, the only sentence anybody ever remembers from this book is the first sentence, which says, missions exist because worship doesn't. You know, and I had these worship leaders coming up to me and say, oh, I love this sentence. I love this. This is so great. And it really did serve a lot of people who did international worship ministries. But I could tell they're taking my meaning to be worship services. Missions exist because worship services don't. I said, that's not what I mean. The key that preserves the error from happening is Matthew 15:8. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me. That's the text that drives me in the distinction between, I think the language I've used, I mean to anyway, is that the essence of worship is here. Forms and extensions and expressions of worship are this: singing, praying, kneeling, conversing, preaching. All those are forms, and they can be totally empty with zero worship happening in worship services. Zero. The Lord is holding His nose in the Old Testament during the solemn assemblies. What do you mean you're holding your nose? They're worshiping you. Listen to the language. It's Yahweh, and they're praising. And He says, they're not paying their laborers. So I don't like emphases on form. And what I mean by the New Testament being so different from the Old is that, oh my goodness, there are almost endless instructions to how to worship in the Old Testament outwardly, right? There's endless instructions for how to do it right. And there's almost nothing in the New Testament like that. Almost. I don't want you to say that Piper thinks there shouldn't be corporate worship services. Okay, everybody hear that? I make a case in my preaching book. In fact, I had a missionary write me and say, we got a lot of missionaries who don't believe in preaching. You got anything to defend the normativity of preaching in worship services? I said, yeah, I wrote a book. It's called Expository Exaltation. The first quarter of the book is about that. I believe that you can read your New Testament carefully and know you ought not to forsake the assembling of yourselves together, and there's enough evidence that you ought to sing in those services and you ought to preach in those services. So let it be said, Sunday morning, I sit right over there and I love it. My marriage has been saved by corporate worship services. I've told Noel that. You know, you have a squabble with your wife Saturday, you're not talking. You're emotionally ticked and you're self-pitying. And you come into a service and suddenly lift up with 400 or 500 people the bigness of God, the mercies of God, the kindness of God, and you feel like an idiot. Why am I wrecking this relationship with my peaked emotional, self-pitying selfishness? I mean, I seriously believe God has appointed corporate worship services to save marriages and other things. I love corporate worship, but I love real worship here more. Where are we?
Well, I have a little bit of a hypothetical for you. Suppose there is a young couple who is interested in missions and has been praying for a door to open for several years. Then suddenly a door opens before them. However, as they investigate this opportunity, they suddenly realize that serving overseas would look quite different from what they had expected. Therefore, the couple is then split over what action to take. One desires to continue ahead, while the other is unsure that this is truly what they're being called to do. What encouragement and advice do you have for this couple?
This is the answer to your question. He said, what's the most interesting one? I said, so let's talk about complementarianism. We got 1 minute. That's not going to happen. Okay. Some of you don't even know what that word means. We're complementarians. John Piper is. Bethlehem College and Seminary is happy to use that word. It simply believes that when we read Ephesians 5, wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord, and husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, because he's the head. So now you got headship, husband, taking his cues from Christ, and you got submission, wife, taking her cues from I would say, a glad, obedient, maturing church. And that's what marriage is. The world doesn't know that's what marriage is. They don't have any idea what marriage is. In the Bible, marriage is a parable, a drama of Christ and the church. That's what it's for. It was conceived that way from the beginning in Genesis chapter 2. Okay, so that's complementarianism. Husbands lead, they provide, they protect, and wives are glad to have it so. Give me a man like that, a mature man that I can respect. And he's biblical, he's through and through Christ-like. I'll go anywhere with him. That brings us to your question. I'll bet everybody's assuming the guy wants to go and the woman is dragging her feet. In my 40 years at this church, that's not been the case, mostly. It's the women who say, honey, let's go. And he's saying, I'm not sure. Maybe we didn't have it right. So let me just deal with both. Like, what do? You believe in complementarianism. You got a wife who wants to go, and he doesn't. And you got a husband who wants to go, and she doesn't. Those are the two scenarios. And I don't think they're solved in exactly the same way. It's the non-parallelism that makes you a complementarianism. So let's go with the guy first. He wants to go. He believes it's God's will that they go to the mission field, and now she's seen enough that she's back, and so I'm not sure about this. What does a head do? He remembers, and this is where you got to be so biblical, you got to be so careful. He remembers, okay, I'm like Christ, I'm not Christ. I'm not infallible like Christ. I'm not sinless like Christ. And that's enough to make him slow to take Christ's place in her life. This woman has a direct line to Christ. That's the priesthood of the believer, right? And she's claiming that her sense of this is not so sure. And his is saying something different, and he knows he's not God. And therefore, he doesn't preempt conversation. He doesn't assume, I don't need counsel, I don't need wisdom. She's my body, but I'm not paying attention. That's crazy, right? That's crazy. It's not only crazy because it's unprincipled biblically, it's crazy because you gotta have her on board, man. You can't have her dragging her feet. You gotta be together. It's not gonna work if she's not in this. And not everybody did that in history. So that's the first thing. So that means he's gonna say, tell me the problems, and he's gonna take the time to listen. He's gonna take time to discuss. He's gonna take the time to argue. He's gonna read the Bible with her. He's gonna pray with her. And over time, he's gonna hope that they come together. And here's the difference between the other one we'll talk about in just a second. There may come a point where he discerns she's strong enough, she's got these misgivings. It's time. We're going to go. You can do this. And I think she should say, you're the man. I'm going. That's complementarianism. Okay, but he didn't do that tomorrow. Now, what if she wants to go? And he said, I don't know. And she's not the head. And she wants to persuade him, and she ought to want to persuade him, because that's the way it is in 1 Peter 3. The wife is desperately trying to win her husband to Christ, or in this case, win him to the missionary calling that they once had, and she thinks they still have. And she's going to do similar things. She's going to pray, she's going to talk, she's going to give her reasons, and she's going to be patient, she's going to wait, but she will not, like him, come to the point and say, we're going. Pack your bag, hubby. That's not going to happen in a complementarian marriage. But she can win him. She can win him. And she needs to. I mean, they've got to do this together. That's the bottom line is, I mean, just maybe close with this. I stood at the front there for, well, this building was built in 91, whatever, 30 years and so, and 20 years in this building. And people come to me with after services, the most intractable questions. Like, I don't have any idea what the answer is to your question. I mean, you said, if I do this, I'm damned. If I do this, I'm damned. It's just, there's no way forward in this relationship with my dad or my wife or my employer. And I would generally say, look, I don't know, but I do know there's a third way. God has a third way. A way that will be obedient and right. And right now, you can't see it, I can't see it. But God can see it. Let's ask him. And I would say that. Like if she says, this is a deadlock, man. This is going to be miserable for the next 10 years. Or he might say that. And I'm going to say to that couple, no, there's a way. There is a way. God will show you a way. You're going to have a happy, fruitful marriage of ministry together. He's going to make that happen.
Okay, thank you, Pastor John. Would you join me in expressing appreciation for Pastor John and for these students?